and thank you all for waiting for me. And on that note, my today's keynote will be titled Slowing Down the Machine, Why Governance Matters. Governance matters for a variety of different reasons. One of them is that accidents and mistakes happen. So my name is Mustać, and I've been working with organizations for the past couple of months, trying to help them build up governance processes because of the mistakes that happened. It should have been the other way around. We should build governance processes so that mistakes don't happen in the first place. But when we are moving too fast, that seems to be the default. Things happen and we kind of react instead of proactively try to combat some of these things and some of these risks before they happen. So some of the things that do happen are data breaches. Some of the things that do happen, and probably one of the most interesting anecdotes that I have personally had the pleasure, or rather displeasure, on counseling on was essentially internal in-house chatbots acting as a sort of a gossip machine. So what happened in one particular case is that they integrated a chatbot throughout an organization. It was a huge multinational organization, and of course there were certain things that not all employees should have been able to actually access. What ended up happening is that if you ask the chatbot to actually give you information on a particular document that you were not supposed to have access to, the chatbot would actually say all the confidential information that was in those documents. In that particular case, it was nothing very personal and very severe, but if these types of things are not to happen, there has to be a framework for how we are dealing with such devices. And of course, it goes much worse than in this particular case, because there's also things happening all around the globe. There are data leaks. There are serious mistakes that cost Deloitte, for instance, a couple of $100,000 in Australia, Canada, and Albania recently due to AI-generated reports. There were various systemic risks recognized and partially also addressed in the UK, the Netherlands, where imperfect algorithmic systems were used at scale to decide things such as social benefits, where the harms that were done by imperfect algorithms making these decisions were only recognized much, much later when the harm has already occurred. And then the best that you can do, right, is kind of try to compensate for that damage and say that this will never happen again. But the thing is, these things should never happen in the first place. Chatbots should not be used for gossiping. They should not be making decisions. They should not be making decisions such as deciding who gets how high of a credit score, or who gets access to social benefits, or who gets access to education, or for HR purposes. These are all fundamental decisions, and outsourcing them to automated systems is not really a viable strategy, and yet this is what's going on in society nowadays. What this leads to, also as a young person who has partially grown up with at least some of these systems, right? So the systems in the Netherlands have been implemented for at least a decade. So the scandals actually go back to 2009 when the system was first implemented. So this is not a new ChatGPT occurrence. This has been going on for a while. And I personally see governance as a way of putting the brakes, of intentionally putting the brakes so that we can think before we act. And so what is governance? Now, I have here put up two definitions that I think are quite successful in defining what governance is, or at least the way that I see it. One is from Wikipedia, very plain and simple. Governance is the overall complex system or framework of processes, functions, structures, rules, laws, and norms born out of the relationships, interactions, power dynamics, and communications within organized groups of individuals. What I like about this definition is that it is incredibly broad. And this is what governance actually is. It is everything that we do within a certain organization. And organization, again, writ large and construed very broadly, which means that it can mean virtually anything, whether it's a small organization, a small NGO, such as, for instance, Figu Trust, or it's a global multinational corporation. There should be certain processes, functions, structures, rules, laws, and norms in place that fit that particular organization and that make sure that certain power dynamics are addressed, that certain risks don't materialize. The second definition that I put on the slide is one by IBM, which deals with AI governance in particular, since this is also the topic of my presentation today, which says that artificial intelligence governance refers to processes, standards, and guardrails that help ensure AI systems and tools are safe and ethical. AI governance frameworks direct AI research, development, and application to help ensure safety, fairness, and respect for human rights. Now, there are several things that I like about this definition, and there are several things that I don't like. Processes, standards, and guardrails are great. Processes, standards, and guardrails help us actually make sure that decisions are made by proper individuals with proper authority, proper knowledge, and that risks don't materialize. However, when it comes to safe and ethical AI or fairness and respect for human rights, it's very fluffy, right? We have to specify our goals more clearly if we are ever to hope to even achieve them. And so to specify these goals more clearly and to explain to you how I personally think about AI governance, I will take you through a few practical things that I always like to consider when thinking about these things. So first of all, I've already spent a lot of words on this, so I will not spend many more. Why does it matter? Because it can serve as this stop point, as this rationality checkpoint, sanity checkpoint for what happens if we automate this. Efficiency is only a value added if it actually works and if we actually know why certain things are happening. Efficiency at an uncontrolled, unprecedented scale where it completely avoids humans and is free from all supervision is not a value added. It's just speed. Speed is not always good. And so what does AI governance mean now, talking very practically and building on top of that IBM definition, which I mentioned previously because I do not think that it's comprehensive enough. It means processes, it means structures, it means rules, and it means roles. And here, the most fundamental thing that I see, which the IBM definition is lacking, is this idea of roles. Because it is, at the end of the day, still humans that will carry the responsibility when something does not materialize or does not happen in a way that it was supposed to happen. There is no dog ate my homework. There is no, it's the algorithm's fault. It will be the fault of the humans who carry the responsibility for a certain process, for a certain structure, for a certain role that will carry the responsibility of mistakes happening, such as in the case for UK and the Netherlands and their social benefit algorithms. It was the organization that carried the blame. Who precisely in the organization was to blame? I cannot answer that question, but I can guarantee you 100% that there was a human found who was responsible for what had happened. And the same thing must have happened with Deloitte as well. There was a person who used the algorithm in a way that was not fit for purpose. The problem is, of course, if you don't have processes and structures and don't decide who is responsible a priori, then this turns into a blame game instead of someone being actually responsible for responsible AI use. And so where to begin when thinking about AI governance? Of course, the laws. There is a number of laws out there currently. There are more being drafted every day. This is turning into a bigger and bigger topic. The EU is a big player, of course, with the EU AI Act, which is also always my starting point, simply because it is the world's first comprehensive legal framework for artificial intelligence. So that means that it regulates use. It is, to an extent, technology neutral. What that means is that it applies to various different technologies that we broadly think of as artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a meta concept. It's not a particular technology, it's a set of technologies, and the EU AI Act attempts to address them all. That is one of its biggest strengths. One of its biggest defaults is that it also got distracted by foundation models. Foundation models means ChatGPT and the whole lot, and kind of derailed into specifically regulating that particular technology. But the framework that it provides is still a valid framework for responsible AI use and deployment, and also development, I'm sorry. So use, deployment, and development, which is the most comprehensive one that we have. Other than that, countries such as Brazil, Canada, Korea, Japan, they have all been doing things and kind of regulating bits and pieces of the whole equation, but EU provides a very comprehensive way of thinking about it, even if you are not subject to EU law. If you want to build systems responsibly, that is probably a good place to look. It also references a lot of standards issued by international standard organizations and industry bodies, which provide deep technical expertise on the matter and provide a lot of guidance for how do we construe these things. But very plainly and simply, where do we begin with small organizations, with AI literacy, with what we are doing here right now, with conferences, with conversations, with discussions? That's where it all begins. Internally, at an organizational level, however, this has to be structured. So the way that I structure it in my personal approach is that I look at the gaps. So not everyone has to be educated on the same things, right? If I am a tech developer, if I'm a computer scientist, I don't have to be explained how the technology works. That's my domain, I know it. But would it be beneficial for me to know what the ethical consequences are of some of the design decisions that I'm making, of what are the legal consequences of some of my design decisions? Yes, absolutely. And the same applies, for instance, for legal professionals. Knowing the law is great, but if I don't understand the technology, I'm missing a key component of this puzzle, and I do not see the full picture. So AI literacy, educating the people who work with the tools, who use the tools within the organizations, is absolutely essential, and it is also the first stepping stone. Before the people know how to use the tools, before we teach them how to use the tools responsibly, there can be no responsible use because they are simply unaware of most of the risks that we are dealing with here. And of course, this is a recurring iterative exercise. This is not a one time and check it off the list. The technology is developing at a pace that we are hardly keeping up with. Laws are constantly outpaced by the speed of technology. There are new tools, there are new gadgets, there are new features of certain tools published every single day. And if this is not done on a continuing basis, then, well, we will find ourselves in the exact same spot just a year later after we did our first AI literacy training, for instance. Second thing, which is kind of very plainly and simply where to begin, and which quite ridiculously, I think a lot of organizations are still not on top of, is just how many systems do I have in place? So the Article 17 that you see here on the slide is the Article 17 of the EU AI Act, which again quite usefully says, hey, maybe you should have a strategy for regulatory compliance. I don't think that it's just a strategy for regulatory compliance. I think there has to be a strategy for dealing with the systems in general, and that begins with knowing which systems you have. An AI inventory is good for tracking assets, it's good for monitoring accountability, it's good for efficiency and effectiveness, making sure that the systems that you have in place have a responsible person, that people know how to use them, etc. And they're also good for ensuring compliance, but that's the last step of the equation. From the organizations that I've worked with, only very few have any type of inventory, any type of repository of the digital systems that they use. Until you know what is being used internally, and you can gather the data for that by asking the people what they're using, You can tell them which tools to use, but before there is this fundamental knowledge of what is going on in the organization, we cannot even talk about responsible use because you don't even know what the people are using, let alone how to control for it. Which is also how I assume that mistakes like Deloitte using generative AI to issue reports to governments for multi-$100,000 deals happens because someone somewhere used generative AI without being properly monitored, without being properly taught how to use it, and simply seeing efficiency as a gain in and of itself. I did the report faster. That's a win. It's only a win if it actually works. One other thing, which is basically an overarching topic of the two steps that I mentioned previously. So first, teach the people how to use the tools. Second, know which tools you have in place. And then third, actually give the tools to the people and make sure that a human is always in the loop. Now again, behind this picture that I created, you see words. Those are words from the EU AI Act. So as you can see, I always keep referring back to the EU AI Act. There can be a lot of criticism, and I myself personally have criticized this law for a variety of different reasons. But it still provides a useful framework for all the things that companies should and organizations should be thinking about when thinking about use of technology for efficiency gains, for creativity, for whatever it is that you are using it for. And human oversight is one of them. Humans have to be involved in every stage of the process, whether you are developing technology yourself, choosing design features, choosing which data to take into account, choosing what the system is intended for, or you're simply trying to decide where to put it in an organization, what to automate, what to optimize, which values is this system supposed to report. Humans make all that decisions. As I said, data choices, performance and validation, and then finally outputs. We cannot have algorithms making crucial human life-changing decisions before we actually make sure that they are working correctly. That is, if we ever can come to a point where we are 100% confident that the system has it right. Until that point, there has to be a human involved who will check overall performance and who will also intervene in decisions that are particularly crucial. This also applies for generative AI, right? Every single piece of text, every single image that is created, a person has to check it, a person has to vouch for it. Back to the metaphor we had prior, no dog ate my homework, no algorithm invented my quote or reference or case. It is you who use the algorithm and it is your responsibility, and subsequently it is the organization's responsibility as the organization hires that particular individual, and so you're the one responsible for all the outputs. And unless you implement human oversight strategically and from beginning, the only thing that you will have is mistakes, damages, and cleaning up the mess afterwards. And that is just a bad decision on an organizational level, but also on a very human and personal level.